Today we will be studying Gwendolyn Brooks' A Song in the Front Yard, which presents the reader with a strong female voice which is talking about discontentment and desire and the need to see a new way of life. An introduction to African American poetry should actually, of course, always begin with the idea of the African Americans who first came to America itself. So the first African Americans were a group of about 20 who were enslaved in Jamestown in Virginia. The fact that slavery enters more or less around 1607, though actually it begins to get a firm foothold in America only in the second decade or so. But from then on, there is no looking back for the slaveholders. Slavery is an accepted part and a right of the white Americans in America from that year onwards. The first slaves were not in the business of writing poetry. In fact, they had no education to speak of. Few of them, even the house slaves, were encouraged to get any education whatsoever. And so whatever little they knew was expressed by the songs that they sang while out working in the fields and so on and so forth. However, the first poem we now know is something which is called Bar's Fight, written by Lucy Terry in 1746, though it was not published till 100 years later. The first poem to be published by an African American was by Jupiter Hammond in 1761, An Evening Thought. The first volume of verse to be published by an African American was Phyllis Wheatley's book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, which was published in 1773. However, poetry was not the preferred mode of expression of the African Americans in these early years. Their preferred mode was the autobiographical prose narrative. All of them wrote about their lives as slaves, especially once they had achieved freedom. So all of them, the African American slave narrative is the crucial mode for expression for African American slaves. Amongst the early major poets in the African American canon is George Moses Horton, who with 3 volumes of verse was the first significant African American poet. He paved the way for Paul Laurence Dunbar, who demonstrated his talent by producing very fine lyrical poetry, which achieved fame in his lifetime and of course continues to be famous today. He published 3 volumes of poetry before he died, very young, and these volumes of poetry were published in the 1890s. However, it is in the 3rd and 4th decade of the 1900s that African American poetry really comes into its own with the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance boasted poets such as Countee Cullen, Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, etc. And the impetus that the Harlem Renaissance gave to African American poetry continued with poets such as Margaret Walker and Gwendolyn Brooks. Margaret Walker won the Yale Prize in 1942. Gwendolyn Brooks, our poet for the day, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1950. These were the first major prizes to be won, national level prizes to be won by African American poets. The Black Arts movement of the 1960s and the early 70s was the next major movement in African American poetry and literature. It saw the arrival of poets such as Amiri Baraka, Larry Neal, Nikki Giovanni, etc. Gwendolyn Brooks, who had started writing in the late 1940s, continued writing through the Black Arts movement, and these poets spoke clearly about racial confrontation and black pride. The poetry of the Black Arts movement made it possible for African American poetry post-1970s to find its own distinctive voice, one in which black poetry, black music, and black speech came together with their distinctive rhythms and rhyme and with a certain voice of its own. And finally, all of this came together to find a performative aspect as well. In the last few decades, African American poets such as Lucille Clifton, Audre Lorde, Rita Dove, Michael Harper have individualized their voices and have flourished and written poetry. Gwendolyn Brooks lived from 1917 through till 2000, and she continued writing and publishing work till her death in 2000. Gwendolyn Brooks is an interesting figure in African American poetry because her life spanned several crucial movements in the history and literature of the African American community. In the beginning, when she first started working and writing in the realm of poetry, she met Langston Hughes and she came under his influence. He advised her, interestingly enough, to read poets such as T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. Her first volume of poetry, A Street in Bronzeville, was published to both critical as well as popular acclaim in 1945. In 1950, of course, she went on to win the Pulitzer Prize, the first African American to do so. In the late 1960s, she came under the influence of the Black Arts movement. Now, the Black Arts movement was a radical movement which involved a lot of anger and not connected with literature and culture. It involved a lot of violence as well. But for Gwendolyn Brooks, her mode of writing did not change so much. Protest had always formed a strong theme in her work, and it continued to do so. The anger which was apparent in the writing of other poets and other writers during this period was not really so apparent in Gwendolyn Brooks's work. However, the effect of the Black Arts movement on her work was felt more in other realms. She, who hitherto had published with a mainstream publisher, now moved to small black publishing houses, so that she identified herself as being a black poet writing in a black community, where earlier she had just been an American poet, writing of African American issues maybe, but writing in the larger American community. Gwendolyn Brooks continued to explore issues of racial oppression, injustice, and the need for change in her work through her career. She also, of course, did a lot of other work which was interesting, and this was especially so because she mentored African American poets and believed in the power of poetry and the radical need for poetry even for urban inner school students. We move on now to a reading of the actual poem, A Song in the Front Yard, by Gwendolyn Brooks. I've stayed in the front yard all my life. I want a peek at the back, where it's rough and untended and hungry weed grows. A girl gets sick of a rose. I want to go in the backyard now and maybe down the alley. To where the charity children play, I want a good time today. They do some wonderful things. They have some wonderful fun. My mother sneers, but I say it's fine. How they don't have to go in at 8:45. My mother, she tells me that Johnny May will grow up to be a bad woman, that George will be taken to jail soon or late, on account of last winter he sold our back gate. But I say it's fine, honest I do, and I'd like to be a bad woman too, and wear the brave stockings of night black lace, and strut down the streets with paint on my face. The speaker in the poem has been interpreted variously by various critics and readers. The general agreement, of course, is that this is a young girl who leads a fairly protected life, sheltered from all the tough, harsh realities of the world outside. And this protection comes to her mainly from her mother, who is not just protecting, but some might even say controlling of her and her life. However, beyond this point, there is little or no consensus regarding who this girl is. Can we identify this girl as being black or white? Can we identify this girl as being an entirely innocent young girl, or is she somebody who is more knowing? Is she naive? Is she silly and stupid and foolish? We do not really know, nor can we quite certainly say any of these ones. When the persona says in the first line that she has stayed in the front yard all her life and that a girl gets sick of a rose, we understand that this is a girl who has never really ventured out into the harsh world, that this is a girl who has lived a very limited life. She has stayed in the front yard all her life. She has not even gone out into the backyard. And then, of course, the fact that she says she's sick of a rose. So she doesn't really know anything other than the cultivated, carefully tended flowers of the front yard. At the same time, the voice itself tells us that this is not exactly a girl who only knows this much. She does know other things about life. So she's not utterly lacking in knowledge regarding what happens to people or what are the kind of people who live outside the front yard. So she knows that there is Johnny May, who will grow up to be a bad woman, as her mother says. Then there are the charity children. There is George, who sold the gate. And then, of course, there are the women who walk down the alley in the evenings. So she has observed a lot of stuff. She has not participated in the life that is beyond the front yard. She has watched people. She has listened to what they are doing. She has seen what they are doing and interpreted it as being wonderful fun. But she herself has lived separated from all this. Usually, the poem is read as being a white girl speaking about the fun that black people seem to have, or it is read as a black girl who has led a very sheltered, protected life, who is maybe not exactly of the lower classes amongst the blacks and who yearns to be part of them and enjoy their kind of life. So we cannot really have a definitive answer as to who this girl is, but we do know that the girl is somebody who has lived a very sheltered life and who would like to experience some more of the real life that she sees being lived beyond her front yard, in the alley that leads to her backyard. The location of the speaker in the poem, we now know that this is a young girl who's speaking, a young girl who tells us very explicitly that this is a song which has been sung in the front yard. So her location is the front yard, and yet from that front yard she sees into both the backyard as well as an alley that seems to abut onto that backyard. Now, this girl is somebody who is young, who's fairly naive, even if not innocent, and who is also in the control of a mother who seems to dominate her life and who also advises her as to what things are likely to turn out as. Her life is a rose that she speaks of at the end of the first stanza when she says a girl can grow sick of a rose. She is that rose. Roses, as we know, though they were originally wildflowers, are now tended, cultivated. They are carefully pruned, looked after, watered, and grown in very specific ways for certain specific reasons, for the flowers that they put out. So they are thus sheltered from living an untended life, an uncultivated life. This girl likewise has been brought up in very specific ways, given a very specific location within which she can be free. She has a very limited life, and this girl is now sick of her rose-like life. The girl, of course, being this innocent rose, is unaware of the difficulties of that life and instead sees it as glamorous, beautiful, and as being, as she puts it, wonderful fun. She also speaks about, and in the backyard she says, there is untended, hungry weed growing. Now, these are of course transferred epithets in the sense that the weed is not hungry, it is she who is hungry, as well as those people who live in the backyard who are hungry. They are untended, as opposed to her, who is tended carefully. Now, to be tended also implies that somebody is constantly taking care of that person or that thing. The girl who is speaking is tended, as opposed to those who are in the backyard who are untended. Now, these epithets belong not just to those people who inhabit the backyard, but also to the speaker of the poem itself, who is herself hungry. As opposed to this, there is the backyard, where hungry weed grows, where people grow like weeds, where people grow and flourish, but they are constantly hungry, maybe for more acceptance in the world, but also maybe for just more material security and prosperity. And yet she is also hungry, hungry to be a part of that world of the backyard. Standing in the front yard, all she can do is look at it, and what she looks at and what she sees is life that is vital as opposed to hers. She sees her own life as that of a rose, which is comparatively sedate, boring, and in the backyard there is full of happening life which is taking place, and she wants to be a part of that. She also, of course, as we read the poem, we see that she locates herself in a space that is primarily ignorant. She talks about the fact that there are children over there and they seem to have some wonderful fun, and they do some wonderful things. Now, both those phrases, some wonderful things and some wonderful fun, are actually interesting because they are so non-specific. What is it that the children in the backyard do? We do not know. She sees whatever they are doing as being wonderful. Further, her lack of understanding of what it means to be a bad woman. What does it mean to be a bad woman? Her mother says that Johnny May, one of the girls in the backyard, will grow up to be a bad woman. And she says it doesn't matter. She doesn't care. She also says that somebody else who has sold the backyard gate will then turn into a criminal. Now, even that she sees as being irrelevant. So we also understand that the speaker, who has been located as a young girl standing in a front yard, is a girl who is standing there and who is actually standing in a space that is surrounded by ignorance. She knows nothing other than the sheltered life that she has led so far. And that sheltered life has made her so ignorant of the real world which is out there, that she does not realize what it means to be a bad woman. She does not understand what those children do that is so wonderful. The things that they do and the fun that they have, though she characterizes it as wonderful, she doesn't really see it or know it or understand it as what constitutes the wonder in that. In addition, there are her mother's words which echo through the poem, because her mother says of Johnny May that Johnny May will grow up to be a bad woman, and her mother says of George that he will eventually end up in a jail sooner or later. So even as she is looking at the backyard, looking at the people whom she sees in the backyard and investing their lives with a lot of glamour and attraction, she is also listening to her mother, who says that these people are all going to end up in a sorry mess, that they will end up as criminals, that they will end up as bad women, and so on and so forth. Yet she does not register that. What she registers is the romance that she has spun around the lives of those who live in the backyard. She is enticed and seduced by the glamour with which she has invested those lives. But it is a glamour which we have to recognize and realize that the glamour that she invests them with is a glamour that is founded in ignorance, not in knowingness. It is neither lived knowledge nor acquired knowledge that she has. It is just pure, simple ignorance that she speaks from when she speaks of those people. A Song in the Front Yard works with two major themes. One, of course, is the theme of romanticizing poverty and hardship. So this girl who speaks, the speaker of the poem, she invests the life of those who are poor and who live hard, difficult lives. She invests it with a lot of glamour and romance. The second, of course, is her own life story, which is also a theme, the desire for liberty and the desire to escape from the sheltered, protected life that she leads. The girl in the poem, who has been tended as carefully as a rose, finds that life limited, lacking, in fact abhorrent to her. She decides that it lacks all charm. What she has, she doesn't want, right? Instead, what she does want is the life that she can see just one remove away. It's a life that is very close to her. She stands in the front yard and she looks into her backyard. She stands in the front yard and she looks down an alley. And in that alley are located interesting sights, interesting people, great fun that she seems to see. She finds all of that infinitely more glamorous than this safe but boring life that she leads. And her repetitions in the poem offer us the clue to her thoughts. Thus she says, I want to go in the backyard. And she says, I want a good time today. So for her, a good time is associated with the backyard. But what we of course know is that the backyard is not a place where you might have a good time safely. Later on, of course, she repeats the vague but promising wonderful over and over again. She also repeats, but I say it's fine, in opposition to what her mother says. Now her mother reminds her twice. One, that George will be growing up to be a criminal. Two, Johnny May will grow up to be a bad woman. And then she looks at the women in the backyard. All of her mother says and tells her that these are people who are not going to be successful in life, that they will all end up in a sorry fate. But the girl says, in response to her mother's opposition and her mother's critical comments regarding the people in the backyard, the girl says, but I say it's fine. Now, that statement, I say it's fine, is of course founded once again in ignorance. What it is founded in also is the boring nature of her own life. So we are not given details about her own life. We are not told as to what she does, where she studies, who her friends are, who she hangs out with, if she hangs out with anyone at all. What we are instead told about is the fact that she has to go in at 8:45 and that she's never allowed into the backyard. So what we know of her life is very meager. It's limited information that we have. Instead, we are told about the people who live in the alley. We are told about her mother's comments about those who live over there. And from there, we realize that she leads a very well-regulated life, a life which is bounded by rules and regulations which are laid down by her mother, and that she has stayed in the front yard all her life. The problem, of course, with all of this is that even as she desires liberty and she desires an escape from this safe, boring life that she has, what she desires an escape from and what she desires to escape to are two different things. She wants to run away from all of this, yes, but all of this that she has is what the people in the backyard and the people in the alley hunger for. These are the things that they desire for themselves. And the fact that they don't have it and that they sell the back gate and that the fact that they will grow up to be bad women because there is no other option, this is not something that the girl realizes. So even as she desires liberty and she desires escape, she also romanticizes the poverty and the hardship that we see in the backyard. And the poverty and the hardship that we see in the backyard is spelled out for us in the two crucial stanzas wherein she speaks of the specifics of the backyard. When she speaks of Johnny May, who her mother says will grow up to be a bad woman. And when she speaks of Georgie, George, who she says will go to jail soon or late. Why? The reason why her mother says that George will end up in jail is because George has already, as a young boy, he has already sold the back gate of this family from which this young girl comes. Having stolen and sold the back gate, he has made a beginning in a criminal career. And that criminal career will, of course, end up sooner or later in a jail sentence. The girl, even while she knows and acknowledges the fact that George sold the back gate, refuses to acknowledge that that action might have resulted from poverty and hardship, the desire for money, which cannot be fulfilled in any other way. She also does not recognize or acknowledge the fact that people in the backyard, people in the alley which runs along the backyard, are poor, so poor that they have no other way of sustaining themselves other than to be bad. Thus, we see a certain degree of romanticization and an investing of glamour in the poverty and the hardship that the backyard seems to present to us. The girl is, of course, unaware of this poverty. She instead gives them glamour, she gives them interesting lives, wonderful lives, and in the process she glosses over both their criminal activities as well as the hardship and the terrible lack that they face in their own lives. Though it's a very brief poem and it is spoken as a dramatic monologue, it's a dramatic poem, the song in the front yard. It is replete, of course, with symbols which come together and help us to interpret the poem. The first symbol which we have is, of course, in the title itself, a song in the front yard. What does the front yard indicate? The front yard is, of course, the safe space because it is in front of the house, and the poem works to construct that safe space. Right? It's a front yard which is in the common view of the people who are there, but it is also a space which is bounded and within which this girl is expected to stay. Juxtaposed with the front yard is the backyard. The backyard, which is seen as a place which has an open boundary. Now, the gate which separates the backyard from the alley and from the poverty that is in the alley, that gate has been sold. So actually it's a porous place. There is an empty opening through which things can enter and through which things can go out. The girl, of course, desires and wants to go out through that gateless opening between the backyard and the alley. But the backyard is also then a space into which other people can enter in. And the safe, boring life that she leads can be disrupted by the entry of these other people through that gate space which has been sold. The rose is, of course, symbolic of the life of the girl. The girl who is tended, cultivated, watered, treated like something precious, something which will grow well if taken care of, that girl's life is the rose. And then of course there are the painted faces and the brave stockings of night black lace, which she speaks of in terms of the women who inhabit the alley, the women who live in the backyard. Both of these work together, the painted faces and the brave stockings of night black lace work together to create a stereotypical notion of women who are strutting down the streets, who are brave to take on the world, and who do not abide by the rules of the patriarchal society, which this girl seems to abide by. Her life is as stereotyped as the lives of the women who walk down that alley and strut down the street. They are stereotyped as being immoral, as walking on the fine line that divides moral good women from the loose women who inhabit certain spaces within the town. She, of course, is this good girl who does not go into these kinds of places, who does not paint her face, who does not wear brave stockings of night black lace. Then, of course, there is Johnny May. Johnny May, who might be seen as being another child, but who will grow up to be a bad woman because she lives in an area where there are bad women. So guilt by association. George, of course, has done his little deed. He has been criminal in the fact that he has stolen a gate from their backyard. But Johnny May, we are not told that Johnny May has done anything. All that we know of Johnny May is that she lives in the area abutting the backyard, and therefore she is guilty and will most likely turn into a bad woman. However, what we also know is that these are all not fixed interpretations that we can have. They are all open, they are all, in one sense, loose interpretations, because they can be interpreted in other ways as well. So the brave stockings of night black lace, even while they stereotype these women as being maybe immoral or loose or even prostitutes, can also then be used as a device which indicates the girl's desire for that kind of an exciting life. Finally, there is the figure of the mother in the poem. The mother who is symbolic of the control, the restrictions that are applied to the lives of young girls by society, especially patriarchal societies, which control and bound the lives of young girls in ways which make it very restrictive, very limited, and which make it impossible for the girls to venture out and do anything or make anything of their own lives unless they have the courage that comes from brave stockings of night black lace. The mother is in one sense as symbolic as the speaker in the poem is, because the mother symbolizes all that the world expects of women, that they will control their young, that they will look after their young, they will tend their young, and that they will protect them from hardship and from difficult situations as well. On the other hand, the mother also symbolizes mothers who try, in the face of hardship, in the face of the fact that there is a back alley there where so much vice, criminality exists, this mother is able to keep her child safe. So the mother can be seen as symbolizing both the good protective mother as well as the controlling, slightly strict mother of the patriarchal society who will not let her child wander. Finally, as we come to the conclusion of this lesson, we look at the title in lowercase, A Song in the Front Yard. The title in lowercase, of course, reminds us of the poetry of E. E. Cummings, but the poem itself speaks in a very distinctive voice of an inner city landscape, a landscape where there are crowds of people, and within those crowds of people there is a small space wherein there is isolation, and wherein there are limits and boundaries which are set from which a child longs to escape.